Well, esteemed guests, welcome to Fellini, Italy Cinema, an online international conference celebrating the centenary of Federico Fellini's birth. My name is Alberto Zambenedtti, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Italian Studies and the Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto, and I will chair today's event. The next session is tomorrow, Saturday, October 10th, and the two remaining will meet on October 16th and 17th. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I also wish to thank our generous sponsors, the Goggio Chair in Italian Studies, the Cinema Studies Institute, the Department of Italian Studies, and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura in Toronto. I am also grateful to our extraordinary social media team, Mohamed Jamali and Giovanna Lisena, and to our Zoom master, Alessio Aletta. Our department is very fortunate that you have decided to pursue your PhDs at the University of Toronto. This conference was organized by myself, Jessica Leonora Whitehead, Marco Malvestio, and Luca Somigli. It is a joint initiative between the University of Toronto and the Università degli Studi di Roma, La Sapienza, where conversations will resume on January 20th and 21st. Before I introduce today's distinguished keynote speaker, I would like to ask Professor Frank Burke, who will keynote tomorrow's session, to say a few words in memory of Marguerite Waller, Professor Emerita of Comparative Literature and Gender Studies at the University of California, Riverside, a pioneering feminist film and literature scholar whose contribution spanned from Francisco Petrarca to Federico Fellini. Professor Waller sadly passed away last March. Professor Burke.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and also to the other conference organizers for giving me this opportunity to say a few words in tribute to Marguerite. The image behind me is of Margie exuding Fellini-esque high spirits in the Rimini home of Fellini's niece, Francesca Fabri Fellini. Behind Margie is a large mural of the Rex ocean liner from Amarcord. And Margie has in her hand one of Fellini's megaphones. Many of you knew Margie and know as well that she died unexpectedly after a short illness on March 11th. There are some wonderful tributes online, many written by Anya O'Healy, who talks eloquently about Margie's scholarship, intellectual generosity, influence on students and fellow scholars, and the fact that she was universally loved in the various academic circles that reflected her vast interests. Alessio has made links to these tributes available. I will not cover all the same ground here, but focus instead on my personal observations of a friend and colleague of 30 years. I loved Margie's take on Fellini in her 1990s articles on Giulietta the Spirits and La Dolce Vita, so I proposed that we edit a collection of essays together for the University of Toronto Press. She agreed happily, and the anthology was published in 2002. Then with Fellini's Centenary on the horizon, I thought it would be a great idea to publish a Wiley Blackwell companion to Federico Fellini. However, I knew I could not do it alone, particularly given timelines, so the book depended on Margie's participation. Happily again, she agreed. We had an extraordinary experience along with our third editor, Marita Gubareva, and we're extremely proud of how the companion turned out. The breadth and depth of the book are largely Margie's doing. She was fabulous as always to work with and elevated the bar with her profound academic intelligence and Fellinian sensibility. Sadly, tragically, she became ill just before, or rather just after we sent the final edited proofs to Wiley. Margie was a fellow traveler in so many ways in my life. Her loss is irrecuperable. I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight what to me are a couple of intriguing and lesser known things about Margie. She would have been part of this conference had the unforeseen not occurred, and she belongs here for more reasons than her expertise in Fellini. She was in many ways a Torontonian doc, even though she lived in California. Roughly 30 years ago, she forged lasting friendships with Domenico and Laura Pietropalo at a conference on Petrarch in Toronto. Domenico, of course, is in Italian Studies at the University of Toronto, and laude as a professor emerita at York University in Toronto. Margie's first Fellini publication, her essay on the Dolce Vita, appeared in Quaderni d'Italianistica, a journal with long ties to the University of Toronto. As I noted, our first book collaboration was with the University of Toronto Press. And 4 years ago, Margie's daughter Leah enrolled in the video game design program at Sheridan College in Oakville, just outside Toronto, bringing Margie to Toronto on numerous occasions. I may be missing even more Margie-Toronto connections, but these should suffice to indicate the cruel irony, even beyond her wonderful Fellini work, of her absence from this conference. My second Margie anecdote, quote unquote, comes by way of David or D.A. Miller, the legendary film and literary scholar from Berkeley. When David learned of Margie's death, he wrote me a kind note of condolence. And in our ensuing correspondence, he said of Margie, quote, "She was brilliant. I still find her La Dolce Vita piece wonderful. And I recognize the many reasons for her attractiveness to many of my teachers at Yale." Margie and David were at Yale at more or less the same time, but did not know each other. Margie was in comparative literature and David in English. Praise from David alone is distinction of the highest sort. But when he talks of his teachers, he's talking about one of the most formidable English departments on the planet at the time, the Yale School, as it was called, that comprised figures such as Paul DeMond, Margie's dissertation director, J. Hillis Miller, Jeffrey Hartman, and Harold Bloom. David's words make clear that at the very outset of her career, Margie already belonged among the most illustrious minds in the humanities. Margie's ability to impress is all the more remarkable, given the huge gender imbalance when she was starting out. Just to give an idea, her first year in graduate school at Yale, 1969, was the first year the university admitted an undergraduate class of women. It was a strenuous, exhausting, and sometimes futile battle for a woman to achieve recognition in academia of the late 1960s and early 1970s. Margie's absence is a great deficit, but her memory and impact are lasting. She will be very much on my mind through this conference. Sadness mingled with the sense of enormous good fortune to have known and worked with her. Thank you.
Thank you for this touching tribute, Professor Burke. Today's speaker is a University of Toronto alumnus and one of Canada's greatest artists, Mr. Atom Egoyan. With 18 feature films, Atom Egoyan has won numerous awards, including 5 prizes at the Cannes Film Festival and 2 Academy Awards nominations. His acclaimed theater and opera productions have been performed at venues around the world. Egoyan's art installations have been presented at the Venice Biennale and other institutions, including the Tate Collection. His latest film, Guest of Honor, which I've had the pleasure to see at the Toronto International Film Festival, stars David Thewlis and premiered at the Venice Film Festival, where he was nominated for the Leone d'Oro. In the next half hour, Mr. Egoyan will discuss his 2010 installation, 8.5 Screens. So without further ado, please welcome Atom Egoyan. You're still muted.
Hello, can everyone hear me now? Good morning, good day. I was very touched by that memorial that Professor Burke delivered, and I realized that it's so moving when we hear someone else's spirit evoked, and I have this considerable responsibility now with this keynote address to evoke something of the spirit of this great master of cinema whose work touched me so profoundly. And more specifically, I was given an opportunity with the opening of Bell Lightbox, which is the Cinematheque here in Toronto, to create an installation in a way to consecrate the opening of this particular cinema, Cinema 4, which is where within the building of the Bell Lightbox, which houses the Toronto International Film Festival, Cinema 4 was dedicated to Cinematheque screenings throughout the year. So this would be a space that would be showing classic art films, new films. It was a space that would be really, it would be a very special cultural venue. And I thought that the best way to consecrate it would be to find a way to create an installation which spoke to the history of cinema, the history of art cinema. So this was a formidable task, and I thought about how to do this, and I thought about perhaps creating something which might focus on a particular artist, an artist who had really had a huge impression on me, and to somehow evoke the spirit of what this artist represented. Fellini came to me very soon because I think that, well, I can't even begin to talk about how influential he's been to me, but I think what I was drawn to when I began this journey into cinema was this notion of that there were these connections to be made between various artists, and that there was this sense of legacy. And I think when I began to discover Fellini's work, one of the things I found most exciting was this notion of transmission of tradition, the fact that he had worked early on with Rossellini, and then he had a direct influence on a whole generation of Italian filmmakers. I think one of my favorite photographs, this is from an exhibition of Fellini that I saw at the Jeux de Paume in Paris. And I'll get into that later on. But within this wonderful catalog, there's this photograph that I always found very touching, which I'm sure you all know. It's Fellini and Pasolini on the set of Knights of Calabria. And of course, you watch that film and you think of how that transmitted to Pasolini, and when he made Mama Roma, that this was something that he was able to inherit. And so very humbly, I must say, I felt that if there was something in that spirit that I actually absorbed, what is at the essence of it? What is at the essence of Fellini's spirit for me as an artist? And then I began to think, well, I can't really address the broad scale of the work, or the broad scale of the transition he made from Italian neorealism to his work, to what he gave to other artists. It just felt too ambitious. So I thought I would concentrate on one particular film. And then as I began to develop this idea, it became clear that I was going to concentrate on one particular scene in this particular film. But I'm jumping a little ahead of myself, because there were other ideas I had as to how to celebrate the spirit of Fellini. I had, in this same book, there are images of, from inside. This is Studio 5 at Cinecittà in Rome. And I was aware that that this space of the studio that he worked was also very exciting. So I had made a pilgrimage to these. This is so strange that we're doing it with this technology, but let's try. I made these are images from Cinecittà where I visited, and this is a reconstruction. This is a set, but we get to the actual Studio 5. So this, I don't know how clear that is, but this is the building where so much of Fellini's work was actually constructed. And I felt something that I was in front of a sort of a church at that point. And I thought of maybe for this installation, creating a reconstruction of that particular studio somehow, and using photographs from the various productions that Fellini had made there. But then it felt more like an exhibition. As I really explored that idea, it didn't feel like it was inhabiting Fellini's creative process. Even though we were focusing on the place where many of these productions had been constructed, there's an amazing photograph here of the, here. for Dolce Vita, an entire street in Rome was reconstructed in the actual studio. But just to show photographs like these in that space didn't seem to honor what Fellini meant to me. And I began to think of what it was about his work, and what it was in particular about 8½. And I think the achievement, the brilliance of 8½, is this ability to move between so many different spaces, between the space of memory, the space of fantasy, the space of reality, the space of the construction of fantasy, that is to say, the process of filmmaking. There was a fluidity with which the structure of that film worked, and something very intoxicating about it. And on rewatching it, I also realized that it was so connected to this subconscious state, a place of dream. This first dream that we're introduced with into the film with the in the car and Guido trapped in the car, the extraordinary faces of the people watching him, the escape from this, and this unbelievable physical image of him floating in the air, attached to the ground with this long rope to his foot, and that being pulled, and him falling into consciousness. I wanted to somehow enter into Fellini's dreamscape. And this was a formidable task. I mean, how does one begin to do that? And one of the things that's inspiring that particular sequence, that dream sequence, if you look at it, especially now with this marvelous new restoration, is that you understand that the actual set in Studio 4 in Cinecittà is actually something of an installation itself, in as much as we have these cars parked together. But if you look at the foreground of that shot, it is a photograph. There is something. There's a point at which there is a frontier between where the real cars are in that scene and where there is a projection of an image of cars, and it's very striking. I had never noticed that until I watched that scene again, and I realized that in many ways, with that image of the real objects and the large photographic image of these objects and this artificial sense of continuity in a space, that Fellini was anticipating many issues around art installations that were to be explored much later on. And so that idea, and also the other thing I noticed as well, maybe it was an actual function of this restoration, but that many of the images of the people watching were freeze frames, that the actual image itself was manipulated in the construction of the sequence. And this happens throughout the film as well, that there are images which are frozen. So the manipulation of the image was something I began to think about. And then I began to focus on, again, going back to this exhibition I saw, which I'm sure many of the people in this conference are aware of. This was an amazing exhibition, which did come to Toronto as well. But of course, it actually contained within it the Book of Dreams. Fellini, as most of you are aware, was very obsessed with dream interpretation and was very involved with Jungian analysis from the early 60s. So this idea of how to address the analysis of dreams and where we are situated in that place between a conscious understanding of reality and something which is subconscious, and where that begins to intersect with fantasy and creative process. Very complex set of negotiations. But I wanted to find a way of expressing that. So I began to focus on one particular scene in 8½, which I think is one of the longer scenes. It's 10 minutes at least, and it's towards the very end of the film. And it is in the screening room. And in some ways, I think, Christian Metz has actually focused on that particular scene as being this incredible hall of mirrors, right? And this notion of the mirror and the screen both being some way of reflecting a sense of absence, right? And so this notion of our relationship to the screen itself became a very important part of this installation. And of course, in that scene, it begins with the white screen of the theater, the cinema, that the producer and Guido and Luisa, that they're all assembled in to watch these possible choices that will play themselves. So there's so many levels of reflection. There's a very, very interesting moment with Luisa, who's wearing Anukame, who's wearing these glasses. She's watching someone play herself in a screen test, in an audition, and she very clearly takes off her glasses, disassociating herself with the person who's playing herself, and leaves the screening room. So I focused on this particular scene, but I also wanted to address something which had haunted me in the film, and it's been obviously something which has been talked about a lot, and refers back to this notion of Freudian analysis, which is the moment very early in the film when there is the clairvoyant, the person who's able to transmit thoughts, and who Guido knows and is a friend. And Guido approaches and asks him to transmit a thought to someone in a garden of this spa. And the thought is transmitted, and the woman goes to a blackboard and writes Asa Nisi Masa. And this has been the subject of a lot of interpretation. It's a word that does not exist in the Italian language. But the common thinking is that it is Fellini did the kind of the Pig Latin version of taking the consonants of certain words and adding a si or sa, and so asa nisi masa becomes really anima, and anima, of course, is a word for soul, but it's also from a Freudian perspective, it's this notion of the female spirit in the male, but it's also this point at which the conduit through which we are transported into this other, into our subconscious. So the original idea was to call this installation Asa Nisi Masa. But as it began to evolve, and I began to construct this meditation on the scene where in the film where they're looking at the dailies, at the rushes, the title shifted to 8.5 screens. Now, I had a very rare opportunity here. Many of my installations have traveled elsewhere, but this one is a very difficult installation to transport, because what it needs is this cinema. And most of these, of course, are empty. Which is a holler subgrade right now. But let's say that a rare opportunity where the Cinematheque had not opened yet, the films had not been scheduled. So I had an empty cinema, which was anticipating a history of showing films. So as I said at the beginning, the notion was to somehow find a way of consecrating this cinema for the task it had ahead of itself, which was to project movies. So I had this. I was inspired by this passage in 8.5 to subvert our sense of how and what we watch, because ultimately, what a great artist like Fellini is able to do is to surprise us and to excite us and to challenge us to look at things from a different way, to transport us, to reconfigure our sense of reality, to energize us, to ignite us, I can go on and on, but I wanted that this installation, which was an homage to Fellini, to somehow generate all these feelings. Tall order, of course. But I thought that the first thing might be that the projector itself be taken out of the projection booth and placed in front of the screen. That is to say that as you walk into the cinema, the first thing you see is the projector at the opposite end of where it's supposed to be. It's in front of a blank screen. And then I thought that wouldn't it be interesting if it was projecting out onto the audience? And then I began to meditate on this notion of, well, what would it mean to take 8.5 specific shots from this sequence and to generate, kind of digitally place these 8.5 sequences, which would be in a loop on one strip of film. So that there would be kind of a reinterpretation of the mise en scène. And there would be a displacement in a sense, because if you know the sequence, which is 10 minutes long, we see this mounting sense of fury that's being generated in Louisa, Guido's wife. And as I say, she takes off her glasses, and at one point she leaves the cinema. Guido rushes out to stop her. They have their marriage is really on the precipice of complete annihilation. She leaves. He says, Louisa, stop at what point, but it's kind of ineffectual. It doesn't stop her, and she leaves. At which point he goes back into the screening room, and he's introduced to Claudia Cardinal, Claudia in the film, who's his muse. And Claudia, who was first presented in the film in this blinding white light in the spa, in his fantasy, when she appears in that scene with the Ride of the Valkyries playing, she is not really there. Later on, there's a discussion of this as being a possible scene in the film he's making. But when we see her now in the screening room, she's introduced in darkness. She's introduced in this from black. And then they, of course, go off on a car trip, and I won't go into the details of the film, but that's the sequence of what happens in that particular moment in 8.5. But in this loop, I reconfigure the scene, and I make the exit of Louisa the end of the scene, and that line of Louisa, stop, is repeated a number of times. And it's much more insistent in this loop than it might be in the film. So it's speaking to an artist's ability, perhaps presumption, to reinterpret someone else's work, or to be inspired by someone's work and to take it into another space, but then to take it into another physical space, because it's obvious that this clip is not to be shown in a traditional way, but to be shown in this sculptural sense, where the viewer walks into not Studio 5, but in this case, Cinema 4 at the Cinematheque, is confronted by this projector, and the projector is beaming out a single source of light. What is being looped on the projector is the sequence of 8.5 separate shots, which cannot happen in film, right? I mean, in film, we are watching a sequence of one shot after another, but in this configuration, 8 different moments are playing simultaneously on one frame. So when you look at this, and again, I hope most of you have seen this on YouTube in either the version that the TIFF put out, which is about a minute long, and I'm about to replay the other version that is, because we're not sure what the quality will be like through Zoom. I'll try and talk you through it, and I'm aware of time here. I'm running out of time, but I will try and talk you through it. But we're not sure. We did a test. We're not sure how there'll be quite a bit of stuttering on the Zoom image, which will actually make it even more difficult to see. But I will talk you through what the idea is. But the one thing that's very important to understand is that when you see a clean frame, if you will, with 8.5 screens, that's what's digitally been processed onto the 35 film strip. So as what's being played on the projector is a 4-minute film loop, which contains those 8.5 screens digitally imposed on that. And then by a miracle that worked way better than anyone might have thought, we found 8.5 sheets that we spread out through the cinema. Most of them were hanging on pieces of rope with clothes hangers, and that was kind of a tribute to this idea of there was something very rural and something very it felt like Remini in a way. It felt like this idea of how people might have seen film images projected on a beach with sheets, but also the sheets obviously refer to how we sleep and to this place that where we dream. We dream in our beds and we wrap ourselves in sheets. So now these sheets were suspended in the cinema, 8.5 of them, and they individually caught that piece of the film projection that fell on the sheet. So if we go back to this notion of the screen as a mirror or as a place of as a place of absence, in a way that now these screens were being filled with these scenes, these moments, these individual shots. And the miracle of this installation, you won't really feel this watching the archival material, but the miracle of it is that people thought there were 8 different projectors projecting onto these screens. And a lot of people who were coming in, who were from the film world, were wondering, well, where are the projectors? Because there only was the one 35mm projector at the front, but it was able to, and we were able to be very, very focused as to where we were placing the sheets and how they were catching those individual scenes. So the exciting thing about this installation is once you entered into the space, as a viewer, you could be anywhere. And what you'll see in this video footage is I'm actually operating this camera, and I'm walking you through what I think would be the ideal way of experiencing this installation. But there were people who were seated in the theater, who were behind one of the sheets, would watch it from that perspective, or would move around, and it was completely open. There was no place that you couldn't go in this installation. So while you were there, you were able to meditate on this scene. You were able to meditate on the artist who produced that, Fellini, who produced this scene. But also, I felt you had something of a way of accessing the complexity and the richness of the various dimensions of our sensibilities, of our perception apparatus that he was able to access. Because I do think that when you watch the film, what is stunning is this play between not only a memory and fantasy and reality and the making of memory, but within some of the flashbacks, you see the people also fantasizing. Of course, the very famous moment after the wine bathing scene, when the children go up and the girl says to young Guido, "Asa nisi masa," where that allows him to watch a painting on a wall and make the eyes move, and make it seem as though the eyes are watching him. But as Fellini composes that, it's very obvious that that is a reference to cinema itself. That the boy, young Guido, watching that painting is watching a projected fantasy. So I could go on, but I think the best thing might be if we now try to walk through the installation in the time we have left. And again, we tested this the other day. I'm not quite sure how fluid it will be. It's very important that you hear the sounds of the installation itself. So I'm not going to be talking all the way through. I'll just be focusing on certain moments. We won't be pausing because that poses something of a challenge as well. But I urge you all to watch this online if this doesn't work. So let's start, please. We're hearing Nina Rota's music here. from the dream sequence in the film. So that's what this is. We're now imposing this onto the loop. Announcing the theater before the projection starts. So this is what it would look like without the projector on. These are just the blank sheets that are placed very carefully over the seats in the cinema. And again, just to give you this, just to give you an idea of what the physical space was like before the projection, before the very long sheet miraculously can hold an entire image in focus. And I don't technically have any explanation as to why it stay in focus, even though they're on different fields, different planes. They seem to be frozen.
Vieni Olimpia. Sì, cammina molleggiando.
Bene,
Molleggiando sui fianconi.
finalmente sei venuto.
Cosa di lavoro?
Sì,
I'm glad to meet you.
ma vorrei parlarti da solo.
All right, I'll wait here. Con che gusto? Adesso vieni a
So if this doesn't work again, I really hope that you can all visit the installation online. Are we able to get this to work at all, do you think? No, we're stuck. Well, unfortunately, we tried. It's unfortunate that. Let's see if it's going to work now.
Ma vorrei parlarti da solo.
All right, I'll wait here. Con che gusto? Adesso vieni al telefono. Scusa. Ma non correre, che cosa succede? Mi sarò rimbambito, fai conti.
Okay, it's not. It's. Again, if you look up 8.5 screens Egoyan online, or I think perhaps it was sent out to you in anticipation of the talk, so you have a sense of what I'm referring to. It would have been nice to have walked you through, but that's not to be. Again, it's a huge honor to have been asked to be the keynote speaker here. I feel that watching. I was rewatching 8.5 last night in anticipation of this, and every time I watch this work, it's so fresh, and it is such a celebration of the excitement of creativity, and also the pain of creativity, and the fact that it's funny that we talk about Guido as being a mirror of Fellini, because as Fellini himself said quite famously, well, I did make 8.5, even if Guido was blocked. If there's something as a filmmaker that's deliriously exciting about someone making a film about being blocked creatively, and yet being able to celebrate that and create this amazing monument to the process. And I've talked to so many artists who continue to be inspired by this work, and there's something unabashed about it. It's completely it's fluid. The ability to traverse these different spaces and is so masterful, and really what makes it so exciting is the purity of Fellini's vision of his creative mission. He is giving himself complete freedom, and he's working with artists around him who completely trust him to embark on this. And that moment at the end, I think, when all of these different feelings unite, and there's this dance around this extraordinary structure that may be destroyed the next day. We are elated. We are so thankful for this creative journey that not only this film, but Fellini's entire career has given us. So I'm very I'll try and come into this conference over the next 4 sessions as much as I can. But I wish you all very well. And again, I urge you, if you're interested to see the installation, to look at it on one of the clips that you've been given. So thank you very much, and best of luck with this conference.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible keynote address. We're really off to a great start. If you don't mind, I have a few questions that I would like to ask you, and of course, we'll source questions from the chat as well, if anybody wants to ask follow-ups. I do have a curiosity that's kind of generated by some of the keywords that you've said during your talk. You talked about connection, you talked about legacy, you talked about this transmission of tradition that you feel Fellini was part of, traveling from Italian neorealism and then modernism and so on and so forth, and then elaborating his own style and being himself an influencer. What a strange word to use these days, but influencing other artists. So I have a question about sort of the material aspect of the installation itself, because you said that it begins digitally, it's designed digitally, but then it strikes me as a sort of proudly analog experience, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, as we mourn the impossibility of returning to the cinema, a cinema where, I ran into you countless times actually watching Cinematheque films. What does it feel like to think about, this kind of, homage and return to the analog in an era where, in 2010, we were already, formed squarely into the digital era, and today are squarely, removed from the physical presence of the cinema itself. So I'm wondering, how well thoughts.
Well, I think that is what I was hoping to show, is that there is this interplay between them. The installation is resolutely analog and very material and very fragile, because it is a film loop, and so one is aware. There's a great moment in the recording when you get right beside the projector and you're hearing the sound of the projector more than you're actually hearing the sound of the loop. And yet this loop could not have been conceived of without digital technology. It is these images are digitally created to overlap and to interplay with each other on this. So it's somehow a fusion of the two technologies. I think that what I mourn, and it's so difficult to create in some way, because it's also its Achilles heel, is that there was something fragile about the film projection process, and that made it quite magical in a way. And as a filmmaker, one of the things that you'll never be able to maybe recapture, is that you are shooting this production, and in the early days especially, you're as you were editing it and working on the sound, you were working on a black and white version, which was called the slash print. And there was this moment when the film negative was actually physically cut together, and you saw the first projection from the film original. And every time that happened, I remember my jaw dropped and I was almost in tears, because it's quite overwhelming. Just that these elements can suddenly now coalesce into this amazing object, which is a film projection. And that, one of the things you cannot underestimate, and it's difficult to imagine when you're watching a digital projection, is by nature of what the mechanical process of film does. For half the time that we are in a cinema watching a film, for half that time we were in a black room, because there was this mechanism where the one frame is 24 times a second. There is a claw that pulls down a frame, and as one frame is waiting, anticipating for the next frame, there is a fraction of blackness, and really half the time. So cinema is a physical persistence of vision in our own minds. Like, it's not constant light. And I do think that there's a physicality to that, which actually transports us easier into this dream place. Now, whether or not, as human beings, we're very adaptable. So even as I was watching 8.5 yesterday in this beautiful new 4K conversion, it's really remarkable. As I say, the details I was seeing, I've never seen, even in the best film projection. So I'm grateful for what digital technology has done. I'm very grateful that these films were shot on 35 film, which means that they are still available for this process of restoration. And that's what I think I was trying to do with this installation as well, was to show the physicality of cinema, and also refer back to how many of us might have seen films for the first time projected in our gardens, or in a like our parents might have like shown home movies, and certainly in my case it was literally on sheets. It was the screen became a sheet. So it was going back to this very almost naive sense of what cinema might be. And I think I think Fellini accesses that so wonderfully. I mean, the childhood fantasy sequences in 8.5 are just so wonderful that way, because he finds the energy of childhood. We are able to be back in that space. So I wanted to touch on that as well with the installation.
Well, thank you. There's another thing, if you don't mind, that I'd like to ask you, that actually I sourced from the label to the installation. There's a sentence that really struck me in the description of the installation, which said, they talked about the audition sequence in 8.5 as, quote, possibly the single densest sequence of collective watching ever staged, unquote. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of a certain kind of density in Fellinian cinema.
Well, I think that's what Christian Metz, again, is referring to when he focuses on that particular scene. It's just that, there are so many mirrors, in that particular sequences, in terms of like the various characters watching these reproductions of themselves, but the energy that's generating, and the use of the close-ups. I mean, there's a very interesting selection of shots at Fellini, and maybe I was also trying to just technically allude to this as well. I mean, it's covered in a very specific way, that scene, from this very wide shot at the back of the cinema, and then these piercing close-ups. I mean, that's one of the things about this film, just from a filmmaking perspective. If you look at this sequence, for instance, where Carla visits, Louisa is with her friend at the spa. She's just arrived at the spa, and she's at a table with Rosella, I think is her friend, Rosella and Guido. They're at a table, and then there's this carriage that arrives that Carla is in, and she gets out, and it's the first moment of contact between Louisa and Carla. And just look at that sequence; it's quite remarkable, because there are wide shots, and then suddenly you're in a very tight shot on Louisa, and it's interesting because in the wide, where she's at the table between Guido and Rosella, she disappears. But suddenly, with this close-up, she's given almost a shocking sense of she controls the scene, in fact. But it's not the way you would normally cover that. And I think that if you look at that sequence in the screening room, like the use of close-ups, the use of camera movements, it's very carefully designed. And this is one of the things about Fellini as a filmmaker, which I find so remarkable, is that there's this freedom, there's this ease, and yet there's this tremendous sophistication in terms of camera movement and framing. It's so rigorous. So it's the alchemy between this rigor, this graphic rigor. He was a cartoonist, so he's very aware of framing and composition, but through camera movement and through performance, through these people that he's casting, as we know, like the extras become so important in terms of how he's painting the scene. There's this incredible play between something that's very structured, I would say almost formally precise, and yet something which is absolutely effortless and so free. This is what generates this very rare energy, especially in this masterpiece. I mean, I think sometimes, in the later films, maybe we lose a bit of that, but in this period, it's so well harnessed. All these different aspects are so well harnessed, and also the sense of music, right? I mean, to see a major European artist take Wagner's, now having directed De Valkyrie, to see how he uses Wagner's music, first in the spa scene, but then in the scene where all the different female figures in his life come into play, and how they become like the Valkyries, and he becomes like Wotan in his fantasy. So, to see this the way he uses another artist's work, the way maybe I've done the unforgivable thing of reconstructing his images, but the way he's taken Wagner's music and reconstructed that to serve his needs is really, it's amazing. So this is, of course, we know about the relationship with Nino Rota, but it's using the Rossini, using the Wagner. Like it's very. I'm not sure who his music supervisor was. I'm not sure if Fellini himself was making these decisions. If he was working with Nino Rota, maybe one of you might have the answer. But it's incredibly exciting to see how he uses sound.
I was also really struck by something you said about the opening scene when you said that there's sort of like an artificial sense of continuity, which is, I think it's a wonderful sentence to kind of describe the direction where Fellini is going historically at that point. As you said, like we might lose a certain kind of sense of immediacy and authenticity in the later films, but we certainly find, this artificial way to kind of construct a cinema that almost gestures to modern art, to to a certain kind of abstraction.
I would love to know what the conversation was around the design of this dream sequence, because it, again, looking at it, I've seen this film so many times, and I had always thought that those cars that are blocked, that they went on infinitely. But then when you look at it again and you see that it's a photograph, that he's playing the real cars with this photograph, that anticipates a lot of movements that were to happen in the years after this film, and what the conversations he had with his art designer to make that choice, and to keep it to make it stridently artificial. It's and yet it's taken me these number of viewings to notice that. The other thing I would really love to kind of is that, were those the freeze frames on these in the film? Like, I wasn't sure if that was part of the, sometimes when a film is being restored, there are missing frames, and so the restorer will make the decision to freeze. So that might have been a factor of it. I'm not sure. But if in fact it was a decision, there was also another scene when the children are going to the beach to visit Serafina. There's the first shot of the boys together is a freeze frame. It's not in movement. So there's this sense, and again, I might be reading too much into it, but that the filmmaker is actually interrupting the flow of imagery in this other way, right? He's using freeze frames at certain strategic points. But I don't know. I mean, maybe someone there in the conference has access to that information as to what the thinking was behind those choices. But it's really one of those films that will never exhaust itself. There's just so many choices that are being made, which are deeply mysterious. I mean, it's a deeply mysterious work because it's being sourced from such unfathomable spaces. who's constantly berating him for not being intellectually rigorous enough and not being capable of actually dealing with the role of Catholicism, because he doesn't have the intellectual rigor to actually to explore it. That he's condemned to be superficial in his presentation, and of course I'm not even mentioning one of the first scenes in the screening room is when the intellectual is a noose is put around his neck, and he's summarily hung, but anyway, it's and of course it's all done with great humor and affection. I mean, it's all. This is the thing that's so. I have this story I was going to tell. I didn't know if it was disrespectful, but I have to share it. It's just something, a little glimpse into Fellini's life. I'm being a bit of a paparazzi, but as I was telling you, I had this book from Paris, which is a great exhibition. And as I opened it, this article flew out, which says Germaine Greer reveals affair with Fellini. And there's this one little portrait she. Fellini turned up unannounced at Greer's lodgings, so confident of his conquest that he brought his pajamas and dispensed with his driver until the next morning. He was already on beta blockers and drank no wine at all. There was never any question of his sleeping anywhere but in the bed with me, but he was horrified to find that I slept with the windows open. He changed into the brown silk pajamas with the cream piping that he had brought in his little overnight bag, and hung his clothes up carefully for the next day. And I thought, how strange, like here we are, trying to construct this image of this person through his art, and then we have this tawdry little moment that Germaine Greer presents us with. But this image of the little bag that he brings with him, and the fact that he dismissed the driver and that he was completely anticipating that he would have the night with her, I just thought was also another window, and maybe the subject of another installation. I'll just have a little bag in the middle of a cinema.
That will be hard to decipher at some. That one.
Well, I think it would.
It will require a lot of inside knowledge.
Maybe if the viewer had to wear those brown silk pajamas themselves, and they had to dress themselves
and stay overnight with the windows open
in the cinema. Yeah, but it's I have to tell you it's a crazy thing. The last time I was in Cannes, they were showing the restored projection of 8.5 on the beach. In front of the Majestic Hotel, and I was leaving the Grande Salle Lumière, and I was walking down the steps, and they were actually projecting, like at that moment on the beach, it was the scene that I had used in the installation. And I thought how amazing it is how these things fold into one's life in unexpected ways. So between the little brown bag and the large screen on a beach in Cannes, his images still float through my life in unexpected ways, as they do through everyone. I mean, I just think he's such an iconic figure, and I'm so happy that you're able to devote this time in this particular moment when cinemas are in such crisis. I can't tell you as a filmmaker how horrifying it is to see that we might be losing these cinema chains, and and I think. Over this pandemic, I think people have become so used to watching. I'm very grateful that my films are now on the Criterion channel, and that the collection is available digitally, and yet we become so used to seeing it that way that we somehow have. I hope we don't lose that link to how these films how they were designed. Precarious moment we're in, so it's great that we're celebrating really one of the greatest artists who made his films expressly for the cinema screen.
Thank you so much for all of this. Thank you. I just want to make sure that if there are any questions that from the conference participants, that we have a couple of minutes to address them before we break.
And again, can I just repeat again? I'm sure that this was clear, but the links were made in the invitation, right? So people were able to see this installation correctly.
They are posted on the conference website. Okay. Yes.
I just will say that the Sueno, the music from Nino Rota, is not on that clip. So this was something that we did for this particular presentation. So as you're coming in, you're not going to hear that music, which I really love the addition of, because it kind of introduces it as a dreamscape. So that's not on the clips, and so we were. I'm preparing this now for something else at the another project. So the version that we were going to show today was this version that's going to be used in this new form of it. But that Nino Rota music at the beginning is very, very evocative. Sorry,
Professor Burke.
Yeah. How do we signal that we want to say something? By the way, just by unmuting and shouting.
That's one way to do it, or you can just type in the chat that you'd like to say something.
So we can use the chat function. Okay,
yeah, sure.
I just want to say very briefly, Adam, I'm a very old fanboy. I love your work, and I was so excited to know that you were going to be here. And I teach at Queens, and I actually met you very briefly when you showed Krapp's last tape at Queens. But at any rate, it's so exciting to me because I've always wrestled with the fact that Fellini's work has been loved by other filmmakers, but very, very often disregarded. Within the English-speaking film studies circle, he is pretty much dismissed. And I think it goes back to something you were saying, that the point of art is to surprise, to make people have experiences they've never had before. Critics come to artwork very often with their ideas, and they're not really open. And it made me aware of something within my own relationship to Fellini, which is that I've loved 8½, but I've always been more comfortable with a film like La Dolce Vita. And because I think that's a film that's easier to do film criticism with than 8½, which is basically asking you to engage in an experience you've never had before. So I think a lot of what you said today was very helpful for me in terms of sort of redefining my own relationship with Fellini. And I'm so happy that we have an artist talking about Fellini's work to start off this conference. So thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh no, it was a great pleasure, and it was a great diversion from right now. There's a horrifying war happening in Armenia, as you know, and I'm reading the most terrifying, nightmarish information of this escalating situation, and it was a privilege to be able to escape into this space. It was necessary, and it really reaffirmed what art can do for me in this very, very difficult moment. I think that one of the issues is that sometimes an artist becomes like, in the same way at a certain point you couldn't avoid the term Fellini-esque or Bergman-esque, and so once you get the esque in there, people kind of they somehow think they've got the artist figured out, and they forget about the riches that artist has to offer. And one of the things that someone like an opera composer gets the advantage of, or any theater artist gets the advantage of, is that you have young artists reinterpreting their work. And so, but film is fixed, right? It doesn't get to be recharged by someone else. It exists unto itself, but you have to make the effort to watch it. So what is it that makes us want to rewatch a film? And so many people think they've got 8½, figured out. But I'll tell you one thing. When I first watched 8½, in my 20s, I wasn't in a marriage. I hadn't been in a marriage for as long as I have now. And it's an amazing study of a marriage. The relationship between Guido and Luisa, and the conversations they're having, and the energy that it's exploring. I don't know how personal it was to what Fellini was experiencing with Giulietta Messina, but I didn't understand that aspect of the film when I first saw it. I couldn't have. So these films that we watch in our youth, if they've left an impression on us, yes, sometimes we will be disappointed because the film isn't what we remembered it to be. But believe me, as we all know, because we're doing this conference, 8½, is a film that will surpass any memory you have of it. It's designed to just explode in your mind in a different place, depending on where you are in your own life. I feel that way about, there are a number of films that I hold very dear to me because they have that ability. I think it's the artist who is working at some sort of peak of where they are, and yes, as artists, we're aware of that we build towards something, and it's hard to kind of stay in that zone. And certainly for Fellini, in some ways you can say that he risked a degree of once he became a phenomenon, I suppose, that it was difficult not to. But I even find Ginger and Fred very interesting, to rewatch. I find it really interesting to rewatch now, in terms of what we were talking about before about the advent of video and film, and it's a tremendous body of work. So it really is through conferences like this that's being able to be revisited. But look, I think that anyone will watch 8.5 and understand the very particular energy that and actually what's interesting is you can't imitate it. You can't kind of, it's so much a product of what Fellini was experiencing with his Roman culture at that moment, in terms of the where the Italian film industry was, the constellation of various people he had with him, but these amazing artists. I was watching on the Criterion Channel a conversation with Vittorio Storaro talking about the cinematography on 8.5. It really is, it's amazing cinematography. Not only in the use of contrast, black and white, and lighting, but just the camera movements are so innovative. So there's much to explore.
I'm very glad you mentioned Ginger and Fred, because we have a terrific paper on Ginger and Fred coming on later in the conference by Giovanna Lisena.
When is that?
Giovanna, are you hearing this? When is your paper?
Yes, on the 17th. I'll be part of
go.
the panel.
Thank you.
17th.
Thank you.
I'll make a note of that. What time? I'll look up the schedule.
Okay. I'm being mindful of our time here a little bit. So I want to thank you once again. We're running a little late, so perhaps we'll reconvene in 10 minutes, so at 10:50 as opposed to 10:45. Thank you once again. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for being so generous with your time and with your thoughts.
Okay. Best of luck to everyone. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.